Wellness, and I'm so excited that today I'm talking to Lara Rickard, who is a dietitian who works with women with PCOS. So we're going to be delving into PCOS and how what you put into your body can help your body. So yeah, welcome, Lara.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. We're making it work.
So what I think would be great is just to have to kind of set the scene for our listeners is what is your background and how did you get to where you are today and your speciality?
Cool. Originally, just in terms of like professional background, so I'm a trained dietitian. So after studying, I really went and worked in a hospital. So I'm originally from Zimbabwe, so I worked in a hospital in Zim for a year. So it was like super resource limited, all the things. Anyway, then from there moved across to the UK, and I have worked in various hospital settings, but largely intensive care and surgical wards, and just the more and more time I spent doing that, even though I'm so super grateful for the fact that we even have those, because obviously from an acute point of view we absolutely need them. They were so often I'd just be coming up against just things that weren't necessarily addressing chronic conditions and providing support for chronic situations, and especially from a dietary point of view I felt somewhat limited there. That was obviously my personal experience of that. But in addition to that, I had lost my period. So I had my period for a handful of, literally maybe 4 or 5 times, and then I lost it. So I had it for about a year, 4 or 5 times, and then I lost it for more than a decade. And I just kept being told to go on the pill, and that when I wanted to have babies, then I could come off the pill and they would provide me with whatever medication would support me. And that was the only option I kept being given. And which is such a familiar story. I mean, pretty much 90% of women I see have a similar story to the whole pill one. And again, it's not that the pill itself, as long as you're making informed decisions about going onto it, it's not that itself is needs to be demonized. But I just kept thinking there must be more to this than that, and there must be other options. But I was never given any other options. So having a background in nutrition already, even though it was somewhat more clinical, I then just started doing more investigation myself, came across more of a functional way of doing things. So really that root cause approach and really looking at food and lifestyle factors and the impact that they do have on us. And over time, and through working with other practitioners myself, and I still work with a nutritionist for myself, we were able to get my period back, which was phenomenal, because it was literally, it was just, and I still, every time I do get my period, I'm like, oh, my body, it's amazing. So pretty much every month now, I'm like, wow.
I think that's the thing. I think that's what I've been hearing from so many women is they haven't had periods for ages. They suffer from PCOS, and they get told by the doctors, "Oh, we'll deal with this when you want to have kids." Yeah. And it's kind of, how do we change that approach? Because there's women out there that don't want kids, but at the same time they also want that peace of mind that they've got their period. How can we start changing?
I think it's literally through the education of the importance of what ovulation actually is, and that it's not just about making babies, because that's what we've been fed for so long. It's like ovulation equals babies at a very primal level, yes, but so much more than that. We know that the impact of ovulation and of those sex hormones on skin health, on heart health, on bone health, on brain health, on mood. So I think it's just through that education, and the more and more women I'm seeing, even in recently I've seen quite a big shift in this. There is more of an education and there is more of an understanding, and so I think it's not necessarily going in and having massive resistance and pushback with doctors, but it is just if you have that knowledge, then we're more able to say, but hang on, actually, is this not more true? Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. And then if you're not ovulating,
Mm-hmm.
what in the long term run, say for years, if you're not ovulating, what are the repercussions of that? How can it affect you?
In a lot of ways, because like one of the main things is that when we do ovulate, so when that egg gets released, the little casing that it was in, the little sac that it was in, within 24 hours becomes the corpus luteum, which is just phenomenal that our bodies are able to do that. And the corpus luteum is what's responsible for producing that progesterone. So in that luteal phase of the cycle, that's where that progesterone actually comes in and gets made. And progesterone, as I say, with a lot of the things that I just mentioned, especially in terms of mood and brain health, like neurotransmitter health, progesterone plays a significant role there. It has anti-inflammatory properties, has anti-androgenic properties. And then it will also benefit from, from like a skin point of view as well. So it's just, without those, it's like, what I always say is it's like the equivalent of somewhat of the equivalent of just men having to deal with no testosterone. That's, they have different roles, obviously, but it's just that kind of frame of mind of like, we wouldn't, like, that would never be acceptable for men, but obviously for women, we're just kind of made to deal with, oh, you're not ovulating, here's the pill. Which also, like, when you aren't ovulating with PCOS, that's what also always boggles my mind, because it's typically a condition where ovulation is somewhat impaired, and the whole role of the pill is to stop ovulation. So then, why are we bringing in the pill when we've already got concerns with ovulation to start off with?
Yeah, I do feel like the pill is kind of cure for everything. Like every time you go as a woman, they're just like, oh, here's the pill. That's kind of the experience that I've got talking to different people. My own experience, I'm just like, I think there's a new wave of doctors that are coming through now, though, that are like much more coming at things with a holistic approach and kind of seeing that actually, if you look beyond the pill, there are different ways. So I am quite hopeful that it will stop being the generic prescription for women.
Absolutely.
We can only hope. So do you just want to break down for us, what is polycystic ovary syndrome
Sure.
in a nutshell?
So it's a ridiculous name. It's the first thing I'll say. The reason being, so it's not a like, there's not one test that you can do and then you're going to be diagnosed with it. It's a collection of different symptoms that cause us to meet certain criteria, and that then forms a diagnosis of PCOS. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, so I can't actually diagnose. Within that whole process, though, of diagnosing, you do need to exclude other conditions, okay? Which I say that because time and time again, I don't actually see that happening. So I will see women coming to me and they'll literally have had one ultrasound and not have had any periods for a length of time, and then they'll just be diagnosed with it with no further testing or no consideration of what's actually going on. So there's different criteria that is used for diagnosing. So there's the Rotterdam criteria, which was established in 2003, so early 2000s, not that long ago, if we actually consider everything, considering that PCOS was first kind of established in the early 1900s. Anyway, so we've got the Rotterdam criteria, but what is becoming more accurate or more accepted is the androgen excess criteria, which was again like 2009, so again not that long ago. Essentially, with the androgen excess criteria, the thing that's underscored there is that the high androgens, which are typically considered our male hormones, even though I'm trying to move away from using that term, because as women we do have them and we need them, but that's typically like our testosterone, our androgen, and our GHS. So it's a condition where according to Androgen Excess Society, we need those, the high androgens have to form part of the picture. So whether that's biochemically, so in blood tests, or whether that's in how we are presenting clinically. Okay, so, and the typical symptoms we'll experience with that are acne, our excess hair, and our hair loss, especially at the temples. So androgen excess criteria, high androgens have to form part of that. And then they go on to say that the ovarian dysfunction, so whether that's in the form of irregular periods or no periods at all, forms part of that. And then the cysts on the ovaries, as seen on ultrasound, can also form part of the picture. And then again, underscoring that all other conditions have to be ruled out beforehand.
Amazing. That's a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. Does it make? I can break it. Like, does that make sense?
Or? Yeah, okay. It does. And I think that's the thing. Like, that's what's, again, it's another one of those that for women's health, I think it's so hard for practitioners to diagnose, because it's so similar to so many other things. And I think that is what, as women, we battle with. I think because there's so many different crossovers between so many different
well, that's
things.
The thing is with PCOS is it's, even when other conditions are being ruled out, it's not that they can't overlap. Yeah. So even with something like hypothalamic amenorrhea or hypothyroidism, they can still overlap with PCOS. So even in diagnosing that, you really have to be aware and knowledgeable, and considering the whole picture.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing. Like so if you go to a doctor and you get a diagnosis of something like PCOS, endometriosis or something, the doctors kind of say like, yeah, there's no cure, you're stuck with it. For me personally, I feel that is quite damaging to say to someone, because then you have women that are just like, well, this is it, like I'm stuck with it. What is your kind of advice on that? Do you believe that PCOS is something that is reversible if you come at it at a different point of view? Like, what is your kind of thoughts on that?
Sure. So I mean, I often speak about being able to reverse the symptoms, and I've fully experienced that myself, and there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, women out there who have similarly. What I say, so there is a genetic component to it. But it's, as we know, genes will express within certain environments. So I often use an analogy like an apple tree. So if you've got one apple tree in a field and the soil's really dry, there's maybe some parasites present, the sun's really hot, there's all those things, that apple tree is not going to be producing any fruit. But if we can then come in and actually change that environment, so we can bring in nutrients into the soil, we can ensure that there's adequate water, we maybe change the positioning so it's not just getting all the sun. If there's any overgrowth, we bring in what's needed to address those. Then the likelihood is that, through shifting the environment, that tree is going to be able to produce fruit. And it's the same from a genetic perspective. So even though the genes are there, potentially with PCOS there is this genetic link, but it's the environment that we find ourselves in that will cause those genes to express. So through taking a multi-pronged approach, so nutrition is one of those approaches and plays a massive role, but there are all the other lifestyle factors that also play a significant role in how our bodies express and how whether or not we then present with symptoms.
Mm-hmm. And can you talk us through what are those lifestyle changes in conjunction with nutrition? Sure,
absolutely. So the main things that I'll focus on, and this is very much so my approach, I do very much take a foundational approach in addressing this, but it's a lot of the quote-unquote basic stuff. So sleep is a massive one, and probably the most important one that I will underscore time and time again. And it's not it's actually optimizing sleep, because the research coming out now with inadequate sleep is actually a little bit terrifying, but especially with PCOS. So when we look at a couple of the main drivers with PCOS, the main things that are actually causing these symptoms to express or show up one is inflammation and one is insulin resistance. sleep supports both of those things. So sleep helps to reduce inflammation significantly. If we don't sleep, the opposite happens. And it helps to improve insulin sensitivity. Okay, so really, really focusing on actually optimizing that. And within that, there's so many small steps that can be taken to ensure that, like, screen time, and not only, screen time, not only because of the blue light, but also, like, what are you actually looking at? What is the content that you're looking at before you go to sleep? Because especially with us, with that comparison game that comes in, and envy and all the things that can really disrupt sleep. But as I said, with melatonin as well, that's quite this applies to everybody in terms of sleep. But with women with PCOS, because we tend to have a disrupted circadian rhythm, so our sleep-wake cycle is disrupted, we don't then want to do anything that's further going to disrupt that. Mm-hmm. So, sleep is huge. Screen time, dimming lights, Epsom salt baths, all those kinds of things really are, they seem little and easy, but in doing them consistently over time will really allow for a significant shift to come in. And then the other one, stress is a huge one. And it was definitely, for me, stress was pretty much my main trigger, and I continue to have to do a huge amount of stuff to support myself through that and allow my body to process things in various ways, because as we know, it's the whole tiger thing. Like, we will be looking at an email and freaking out about it, and our bodies are like, where's the tiger, where's the tiger, where's the tiger? And that will override, because often women will come to me and they'll be like, just tell me what to eat, just tell me what to eat, just tell me, like, what's the perfect food for PCOS. Firstly, there isn't one, because it's going to be individualized to you. Yes, there's research that shows certain foods are going to be so beneficial, but we've still got to work that towards what's working for you. But in addition to that, you could be eating your wild-caught salmon with your kale and your quinoa or whatever. But if you stressed out your mind, that's going to be that can override the benefit often of that food. Because often, and it's not only the physiological impact of what's happening there, but also, like, when we, if we're eating when we're stressed, we're often not chewing properly, and then the whole digestion domino effect gets pretty significantly impacted as a result. So those two, movement is really important, and again, it's just beginning with where we're at. So if there's no movement happening at all at the moment, then really starting with, okay, well, what would be realistic to bring in, whether that looks like 3 minutes or something, or 10 minutes or something, or adding on 5 minutes to what you're already doing. But in the same breath, with women, I'll often see the opposite happening. So they'll be over exercising, and then that's just further driving that inflammatory response, and just exacerbating, from an adrenal point of view as well. If we're already super stressed, and then we're putting this additional pressure on, so more often than not, I'm actually reducing intensity or reducing amount of time of exercise. I'm not a PT, obviously, so I'll often work with PTs, but that's one of the things we'll consider is actually, are we overdoing it rather than doing any benefits. So those are the three main lifestyle things, and then the other thing that I really, really focus on myself, and I consider it a foundational thing, is just helping restore that trust in our body, because when we've been dealing with symptoms for 5, 10, 15 years, and we've tried a whole bunch of stuff, but we're literally just grasping at whatever silver bullet people are telling us to try, and then we keep getting told, exactly as we've said, that there is no cure for this, or we're not going to get anywhere. We can then just lose trust in our body. And so much of my philosophy is that, symptoms, yes, we want to reverse them, and we can work towards that. But in addition to that, how can we actually come back to trusting the guidance of our body? Because that's what's going to serve us from here on out, because we can reverse these symptoms, but if life happens and like extreme stuff happens, symptoms might flare, but can we then see that flare as just our body trying to guide us, and indicate to us, oh, maybe this or this or this is necessary, rather than, oh my gosh, I've got symptoms, let me get rid of them, let me get rid of them, let me get rid of them. So that's really, and that's a huge part of the puzzle as well, is certainly in terms of working with me, I make that foundational part of the work together.
I think that's so important as well. I think, like, as women, we kind of, like, I know on my own personal journey, I ended up, I was awful to myself. Like, I think when we're in this state where we kind of feel like there's no way out of these different conditions, women we are so hard on ourselves, and it's really hard to build that relationship back up with ourselves and with our body when we're trying to heal and trying to turn things around. It's a long road. Like, I had my surgery literally to the day last year, and after, it took me so long to actually realise that my body, when it gets inflamed and stuff, it's telling me, it's screaming out, like, listen to me, like, you need to chill. And I think in this world that we're in, we're all like this. It's really hard for women to actually be kind and tune in and actually have, not the guts, but actually be like, actually, I'm not going to take this on, I'm going to say no, because actually my health and my body is telling me that you're doing too much. And I think it's kind of having that understanding, like, in a wider world. I feel like if we had more understanding of these conditions in the wider world, men and women, it might make that relationship slightly easier when you kind of feel that people are a bit more understanding about what you're going through. I think that's more education we can get out there, I think, can massively help with that movement. So it'll be interesting to see, I guess, how important is that mindset in the healing of it as well?
Hugely, so important. And I think, you know, and it's not just like, especially when I'm working with women, I give that space for, you know, let's just meet you where you're at and what's actually going on right now. And if you need to be angry, or you need to be frustrated, or you need to be irritated, like, let's let that happen. Because I think so often we try and bypass that process and get to a place of like, oh, I just love my body, and, you know, fed all that stuff, which is fine, but it's not true necessarily for where we're at. So it's, again, it is a journey, and I there's a little mini process that I just help walk women through in terms of what that what different considerations need to be brought in for ourselves, so that we can, you know, what does gentleness actually look like towards ourselves, and what do boundaries actually mean for you personally, and it's just, it is so, you know, in my journey, I've been doing quite a lot of stuff, and yes, I was working with a practitioner, and we had a lot of the foundational stuff in place, but with how I was presenting, there was deeper testing that was necessary. So we did do comprehensive testing for digestive stuff, and there's quite a bit that came up there, and then, you know, did certain things to address those. So I was doing all these things, I was working with someone at the time, but in the back of my head, because I hadn't had a period for more than a decade, subconsciously, I just kept believing this isn't going to work, like, nothing's going to help. So, and it wasn't, like, at that point, I wasn't being angry towards my body, but it was just kind of this belief that I'd got into, you know, and that's what I often see with women, is they'll have that subconscious belief, but on top of that, there will be that anger towards their body within that, of like, oh, you know, I'm doing all this stuff, but you're not doing anything, and it was in realizing that, and then just, you know, choosing to come to that, or journeying rather, to come to that place of acceptance, because I often view it as like, we start off with this not great relationship, and then it moves to acceptance, and then it moves to friendship, and then we can actually get to the place of like, oh my goodness, I love my body, but we don't just go from like hating it to loving it, and when I got to that place of actually accepting, actually trusting, and actually speaking in a way that was empowering for my body, it wasn't long later that I then got my period back, which was amazing, because, like, as I said, I'd been doing all this stuff, but I hadn't been believing. that it was going to make a difference. So it definitely plays more of a role than I think we often give it credit for.
Yeah, massively. I'm a big believer in mind-body connection.
Yeah.
So you touched upon it there, which I kind of want to go into a bit more. I mean, it's had so much more media coverage lately, but how important is gut health in predominantly most women's health conditions? The census I'm getting is that if we look at the gut, it can figure out quite a lot more. Like, what's your views on that, and kind of where do you go from there?
Sure. So absolutely. I mean, it plays a significant role. I think, though, there's also, over the years, and this was, I think it's, I must check her name, but I think it's Diana Monick, I think is her name. She wrote about this a few weeks ago. But the whole thing of like, everything's about the gut, and it's only about the gut. Yes, the gut plays a significant role, but it's also appreciating, knowing the genetic impacts of traumas, for example, and how trauma can be passed down through significant generations, and how that then, like the impact that has on who we are and human behavior and all the things. So it's not, I think when it comes to gut health, it's not so much just we'll do tasting, we'll see what's there, we'll do a protocol and everything will be fine. It's understanding that it plays a really important role, but it's not the only thing. It's not the silver bullet necessarily. Having said that, with PCOS, it definitely, I mean, and recently I've just had a couple of cases where we've got amazing information from doing more comprehensive testing, that is definitely going to be beneficial and with my one-to-one clients and help us move and the directions we want to be going with. But it does, it plays a significant role in terms of inflammation and in terms of insulin sensitivity. And in terms of just, if gut health is compromised, again, it's that whole thing, like I said, we can be eating the whatever, quote unquote, most perfect diet for you. But if your body can't actually use that, then we're not getting the nutrients that we need. So if you can't actually absorb because gut health is compromised, then those nutrients won't actually be utilized properly. And with something like PCOS, when we're really wanting to support and optimize ovulation, that's somewhat already compromised. It is such a nutrient demanding process. That whole process of ovulation does require a heap of nutrients. So again, if gut health is compromised, then we're not going to be getting in those nutrients necessary in order to optimize ovulation itself. So yeah, it 100% does play a significant role. But again, before we necessarily dive down the comprehensive testing routes, there's a lot I would have done beforehand in order to support us. So the simple things like the chewing and how are you before you're eating, what's actually going on for you? Are you giving yourself time and space to eat, or is it literally in front of the laptop or computer and you're eating on the go? Are you super stressed when you're eating? Again, all of that is going to compromise how your body is able to use that food. And so often when we consider that, certain symptoms that come up like bloating or heartburn or along those lines, they might not, yes, we might do comprehensive testing and see gut bugs or whatever there, unhelpful ones, but those other things are going to be so much more foundational and beneficial long term. It's not to say that the testing won't be helpful, but those other things definitely need to be considered and implemented as a kind of non-negotiable beforehand.
Definitely. So that kind of took care of my question, where you begin with your clients. So do you kind of feel that obviously you said like your background, you started off and you were in different areas and different hospitals. Do you feel like a lot of chronic diseases that you get faced with are actually preventable if you start, like, food is medicine? Do you believe in that? Like, actually, if, as a whole, if we actually came at it in a different approach, what I would love to see is doctors and nutritionists working together. But obviously the pharma companies miss out on it, don't they? But is that kind of what you agree with? Do you think it is? A lot of these are preventable?
Yes, I do, 100%. Like, I fully believe in the benefits of food, and especially in more of our chronic conditions. And it's, it doesn't have to get super complex from a food perspective and from a lifestyle perspective. So both of those things, or all of those things, are so hugely beneficial and can support us health-wise 100%. I think there is a time and place for medication. Because I often will work with women, or like come across women who will feel shame for, because of this whole shift towards finding alternative ways, where there is shame for using certain meds or whatever. And it's not that the medication itself is necessarily bad. It's, as we say, especially if we had that relationship, more of a relationship where there are doctors and nutritionists and other lifestyle practitioners working together, then that could all be a lot more closely monitored. So with medication, what I will often find is that it'll just be prescribed, but the number of times that I've seen a woman being diagnosed with PCOS and then ending up on metformin, but they've had no testing at all done in terms of what is even going on from an insulin point of view, is crazy. And so that I get concerned about. But if it is necessary and it is indicated, and it does provide benefits, and you have it for a certain amount of time, we're tracking the progress of it from a medication point of view, then the food and lifestyle things are just going to support and optimize and enhance that, and likely then reduce the need for actually having that medication. So there's that whole side of things. But in terms of just the power of food, it's phenomenal. And I'm just so grateful, because for so long, even from when I was working in clinics, which was crazy, like when I was working in hospitals, it would often be considered that this was all quackery, like this whole way of doing life was quackery. And subconsciously, I got into that mindset, because it was a lot more of a clinical setting. So it was a lot of like tube feeds and, in intensive care and things. But it was, just coming back to actually like this in front of me, whatever this meal I'm eating, can provide huge, huge, huge benefits. And it's, and then help my body work and help me get my period back. And it's, and like clear my skin and all the things. Yeah.
And what was your turning point? Were you like, I just need a period, like I've had enough? Was that?
Yeah, I think for me it was just quite gradual. I had just kept thinking, there has to be another way. There has to be another way of doing this. And because we hadn't been trained to really appreciate this, which is crazy in my mind that that's what had happened. I just got to the point where I was like, let me just try. And I think it was quite scary for me, because that whole that stage of where we are, when we sometimes it's easy to stay where we are, because then we're not really risking anything. And then as soon as we take that step to be like, I'm actually going to believe in this, we almost we open ourselves up to the potential of disappointment. Which had, in my journey, it had been, until I actually got my period, it had been a good 18 months to 2 years of actually actively working on it. So it's a long time before I'd even seen anything. But I just, even on that journey, I was like, well, the alternative is like go back to what I was doing, and that wasn't helpful. So, or that wasn't getting me anywhere. Where with this, even though it took me that time to get my period, there were still other significant shifts that were happening along the way. So I think, it's just, it's the whole journey and the patience and the like letting ourselves be vulnerable to when we choose to believe. Yeah.
Exactly. So true. And so you mentioned metformin. So what does that actually do? Why is that given to women with PCOS?
So it's estimated that approximately, the numbers vary, but it's about 50% to 80% of women with PCOS do tend to have insulin resistance. So that's essentially when we eat carbohydrate-based food, it gets broken down into glucose. Glucose needs to get into the cell to make energy. Insulin helps that happen. When we have any kind of insulin resistance, that process isn't happening as effectively and efficiently as it could. So with women with PCOS, what tends to happen is that when we've got those high androgens in the picture, so the testosterone, androgen, and DHS, especially with the testosterone is from the ovaries, is that it can then it's linked with insulin. Essentially, the insulin it can be driving up those high androgens. Okay, it can be one of the reasons why we've got those high androgens going up. So the insulin resistance is exacerbating the symptoms that we're dealing with. Okay, so we then want to understand, well, what's actually behind that and what's causing that. What's often thought is that with women with PCOS, if you've got insulin resistance, then the weight is there's going to be weight gain as well as a result of that. But that's not true, because you can be, I don't like calling it this, it needs to have another name, but you can have lean PCOS, where you still have insulin resistance, but it's just not showing up from weight perspective, which was true for me. And again, like, I'd done a lot of the food stuff to support myself, but it was definitely the sleep and the stress, because they play such a significant role, that that needed to be focused on and worked with. So with the metformin, what's coming in there is that it's basically helping to make that whole process of using glucose more effective. But if you haven't actually done testing for it and you don't know whether insulin resistance is actually part of that picture for the woman with PCOS, they might just be taking metformin but not actually need it, because they don't actually have significant enough impact from a blood sugar perspective to need the medication.
It's mad that some women are on that and don't even need it, isn't it? That's quite scary. So I guess to kind of round it up, what would your top 3 tips be for women who are suffering PCOS and just have no idea where to begin or what to do and are just feeling really overwhelmed? Like, what would your top 3 tips be?
Yeah, I think it's really, it's so easy to go into that place of trying to do a million things. Okay, so you'll hear about the superfoods or the special supplements or the whatever, like the new fad diets. Keto is trending again at the moment. Also, and then what I often see is that women will just try all these things and get really overwhelmed, because they're like, I've got a million things to do, nothing's working. But the pattern will be, I've tried it for a week, and then this isn't working, so I'm going to try something else for a week, which is understandable when we're coming from that place of fear. But I often compare it to, like, if you've got 5 different puzzles and you just grab a handful of puzzle pieces from each puzzle, and then you try and make this picture from these random pieces of puzzle. That's what's typically happening. So I think the first thing I would say within that is it's so easy to look for a silver bullet, and it's so easy to try and chase that silver bullet. But if you can really do the foundational things, so those things that I spoke about in the beginning, honestly, spending time optimizing your sleep and giving your, like, not being like, I'm going to do it for a week and then my symptoms are going to change, but really, really committing to that. Give yourself a good 3 months to allow that process to happen. And I mean, we need 3 months anyway from an ovulation perspective. So sleep would definitely be first thing. And then the second thing would be, when it comes to stress, as I say, is really understanding, when it comes to stress, again, what I'll often see is that women will be like, oh, but I'm not stressed. I've got nothing to stress about. Like, nothing big has happened. And I just say, you might cognitively feel like that, or you might have convinced yourself to feel like that, but how's your body actually responding? Every time you open your laptop, do you clench your jaw? Do your shoulders tighten? Does your breathing shorten? Like, what's going on that front? And then finding meaningful ways to, once you've brought the awareness to that, to then support yourself through that. Because it's such a, especially, we didn't really go fully into it, but with PCOS, it can actually be adrenal based, not ovary based. So your ovaries might not even be playing as much of a role. It could just be your adrenal glands, because of the one androgen that's made there. So stress plays a significant role in that process. So it's a really, really important thing to be aware of and then to address. And then if you've got bigger stresses, so there have been traumatic things that have happened in life, again, getting support to actually move through that. So that would be the second thing. And then the third thing, from a food perspective, again, instead of freaking out about like what foods can I eat or what foods can't I eat, that's not necessarily the approach I take anyway. It's always coming to understand why, like what dietary changes we are making and how they can be supportive. But where I would start with, that is a safe place and that can be applied with everybody, is chewing, which is because that will slow us down when you're eating, so that will make you a lot more present with your meal anyway. And that will allow your body to use whatever you are eating in a more optimized way. And with the chewing, it's somewhat dependent on what food you're eating as to how many chews you need. But it's just see where you're at. Like at the moment, if you're just chewing 3 times and then you're done, how can you increase that by 5 chews and then 10 chews and then 20 chews? I mean, ideally, we should be aiming for like between 30 and 50 chews per mouthful, depending on what you're eating. Not many people do that unless we are goats. But yeah, so those would be like the top 3 things I think that could, that aren't going to be overwhelming for women to do. They are so foundational. And then the body stuff, and these are 2 added ones. The body stuff is so important. So just being intentional about restoring that relationship with your body for yourself and what that would look like for you. And then the other thing on this journey is that once you've got those foundational things, and it's always about pushing upstream. So it's always about trying to understand, with the inflammation and the insulin resistance being 2 of the main drivers, what's actually causing those. So, if you've been doing stuff and you aren't getting anywhere, then really getting the support in. As I say, I've got my own nutritionist, because even though I've got all this knowledge, it's still, when we're in our own journey, I was going down 14 rabbit holes that I was just like, goodness knows where I'm ending up. So it is, with women, we often think that we need to get to breaking points, literal actual breaking point, before we can invest in our own health, before we can invest in our well-being. But actually having someone support you on this journey is so, so, so foundational. And just to hold that space for you and to allow piece everything together in a way that makes sense. So that would be bonus tip.
That's so important. Thank you so much for that. That's some great advice. And I guess, like, where can people find you if they want to connect with you and know more?
Sure. So I'm potentially moving away from social media at the moment. Okay. We're seeing. I'm sitting with it for a little bit to see how much it's aligning with values. But at the moment, I am still on social media. So it's Marula Wellness. So MARULA _. Is that what it's called? Yeah, _wellness. And then, but otherwise, the best ways to connect with me would be, well, that's on Instagram and also on Facebook. And then my website is the same, marulawellness.com, and email list there. So there's a lot of stuff that's going to be coming out email-wise with all the information.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. Honestly, I've learned a lot, and I think I hope it is values other people, because honestly, it's it's a whole another world out there, isn't it? But thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and
thank you so much for doing this, because it is, as you've had your own journey, and as it's just so important to provide the education and provide that space and just that reassurance and encouragement that we are pretty much all on these journeys together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, have an amazing rest of the week and weekend, and I'll be in touch.